96-year-old woman versus 1,000 coyotes to save her cow. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's incredible story. Imagine this, a 96-year-old woman, all alone on a small farm, facing down a relentless pack of 1,000 coyotes. Sounds unbelievable, right? But it happened. Let me take you back to a cold morning in the heart of the American West. This is a story about survival, bravery, and the will to protect what you love. Picture it. An old farmhouse, the wind howling through the trees, the cold biting at your skin. Ruth Walker, a woman of 96, steps outside to tend to her beloved cow, a creature she's cared for all her life. She's lived through the hardships of the West, through droughts, floods, and the death of her husband many years ago. Her cow is all she has left, the one thing that has kept her going all these years. Ruth doesn't have much, but she's always managed to get by. Today, however, was different. The silence of the morning was suddenly broken by the unmistakable sound of coyotes howling in the distance. Ruth's heart skipped a beat. She had dealt with coyotes before, but this time felt different. As the sun began to rise, the howling grew louder, and before she knew it, the coyotes were closer, much closer. Ruth could hear the rustling of the tall grass, the faint scratching of paws on the dirt. Panic began to settle in, but Ruth remained calm. She grabbed her old rifle from the porch, the one her husband had left her, and headed toward the barn where her cow was. She knew that if the coyotes got too close, it would be over for her and her cow. Her hands shook slightly as she gripped the rifle, but her determination overpowered her fear. As Ruth reached the barn, she saw them. Dozens of coyotes, their yellow eyes glowing in the morning light, circling her cow. The animal was frightened, its body trembling with fear. Ruth took a deep breath, aiming her rifle. But then, just as she was about to fire, something stopped her. There were more. She turned, and to her horror, she saw hundreds of coyotes emerging from the nearby woods, their numbers growing by the second. It was a full-on assault. Ruth's heart raced, but she didn't back down. She knew she couldn't let her cow be taken. This was her fight. This was her home, and she wasn't about to let it be destroyed by 1,000 hungry coyotes. As Ruth stood there, her heart pounding, her eyes locked on the growing sea of coyotes that surrounded her beloved cow, a feeling of desperation crept up her spine. She had seen animals in the wild before, but never anything like this. It wasn't just a few strays looking for food. It was a coordinated assault, a ruthless pack of creatures hungry for blood. Ruth could see them moving in unison, their eyes gleaming with hunger, their bodies shifting in the tall grass like a living, breathing storm. Her cow, terrified and trembling, was struggling to break free from the encirclement, but the coyotes were too fast. Ruth's hands shook as she gripped her rifle tighter. She had fought through many hardships in her life, but she knew this was going to be the toughest battle she had ever faced. She raised the rifle, aiming at the first coyote that came too close. A sharp shot rang out, echoing through the silent morning, and the coyote fell. But it didn't matter. The rest of the pack didn't flinch. They kept coming. Ruth's breath was heavy as she aimed again, but the coyotes seemed to sense her fear and desperation, moving faster, closing in from every direction. She fired again, hitting another coyote, but once more, it was just a temporary victory. The pack was relentless, and Ruth knew her old rifle wouldn't hold them off for much longer. She needed to think, to act fast. Her mind raced through every possible option, but her choices were few. She wasn't going to be able to stop them all with just her rifle. Her only hope was to create a diversion, to drive them away long enough for her to get the cow to safety. Ruth's eyes scanned the area around her. There, a large rock outcrop on the edge of the field. If she could get to it, maybe she could gain the upper hand. Ruth started to move, but as she took a step forward, she heard the low growl of a coyote behind her. It was too late. One of the coyotes lunged at her, its teeth bared and ready to strike. Ruth barely had time to react, but the sheer force of instinct kicked in. She swung her rifle like a club, striking the coyote across its head. The creature yelped, staggering back, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it circled, ready to pounce again. Ruth didn't give up. She gritted her teeth and took another step toward the rock outcrop, but the coyotes were closing in. With each step, the ground felt more treacherous, and Ruth's strength was beginning to wane. The coyotes were growing bolder, attacking in greater numbers, their growls now echoing across the field, growing louder with each passing second. Ruth could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Her cow depended on her. The bond between them, forged over years of care and companionship, kept her moving forward. She could hear the faint sound of the wind picking up, and with it came the scent of danger, the scent of more coyotes, more of them than she had ever seen before. But Ruth wasn't backing down. Her grip on the rifle tightened. She could feel the weight of it in her hands, a symbol of her defiance, her refusal to give up. She raised it once more, taking aim at the approaching pack. The shots rang out in rapid succession, but the coyotes were too many, and Ruth was growing tired. But just as it seemed like all hope was lost, she saw something unexpected. From the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of movement, something large and powerful. Her heart skipped a beat as a figure appeared in the distance, charging toward her. It was a man on horseback, riding fast, his silhouette cutting through the rising dust. Ruth's mind barely had time to process it. Was it someone coming to help? Or was it just another predator? The man on horseback didn't hesitate. He spurred his horse faster, riding directly into the chaos, with a speed and precision that seemed almost unreal. Ruth could hear the pounding hooves as he drew closer, but she didn't dare lower her rifle. She needed to see what was happening, to know if this man was here to save her, or if he was just another threat. As the man got closer, Ruth finally saw his face, determined, unwavering. And in that moment, she knew he wasn't here to hurt her. He was here to help. Without warning, the man aimed his own rifle, and with a single, powerful shot, he struck down the closest coyote, sending the pack scattering. Ruth's heart raced as the coyotes, momentarily stunned by the gunfire, began to retreat. The man continued to fire, clearing the area, giving Ruth the chance to finally make a move. She wasted no time. She grabbed her cow's lead rope, pulling the frightened animal toward the rock outcrop. The man's presence was a beacon of hope in the chaos, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ruth believed that she might just survive this fight. The man on horseback continued to fire, each shot ringing out with precision. As the coyotes began to retreat, their once unified pack now scattering in every direction. Ruth, still clutching her cow's lead rope, felt a surge of hope rise within her chest. The battle was far from over, but at least now she had a chance. She hurriedly pulled her cow toward the shelter of the large rock outcrop, her legs shaking from the tension, but her resolve as strong as ever. The stranger on horseback wasn't just a man riding to her rescue. He was a lifeline, an unexpected ally in this fight for survival. As Ruth led her cow to safety, she spared a quick glance over her shoulder. The man's figure was a blur against the rising dust, moving with purpose and confidence, pushing the remaining coyotes back with every step. Ruth could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but her instincts kept her moving. The coyotes had been pushed back temporarily, but she knew they would be back. Ruth reached the rock outcrop, her breath ragged as she carefully tied her cow to the sturdy rocks. She had to be quick. The man on horseback was still riding hard, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the coyotes, his rifle at the ready. As he approached her, Ruth finally had a chance to see him clearly. He was tall, rugged, with a face weathered by years of hard living. His dark eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. He had saved her, and she had no idea who he was or where he had come from, but she knew she owed him her life. Without saying a word, he dismounted, walking toward her and the cow. His movements were calm, measured, but there was an undeniable urgency to them. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You're safe for now," he said, his voice deep and steady. "But we need to move quickly. The coyotes won't give up." Ruth nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you," she managed to say, though the words didn't seem enough. The man gave a curt nod, then turned his attention to her cow. "I'll help you get her to safety. You're not alone in this." The reassurance in his voice was a welcome comfort. But Ruth knew better than to take anything for granted in these harsh conditions. She had learned long ago that trust had to be earned. Still, there was something about this man that felt different, something that made her feel, for the first time in hours, like there might be a chance for survival. Together, they quickly got the cow settled, securing her in a makeshift pen near the outcrop. Ruth stayed vigilant, watching for any signs of movement in the distance. She knew this wasn't over. The coyotes were just regrouping, preparing for their next move. As the sun began to climb higher in the sky, the man turned to Ruth. "We need to fortify this area. The coyotes might come back in force. We can't afford to wait and see." Ruth nodded in agreement, her mind already racing with ways to keep her cow safe. She had lived through worse, she told herself. She had lost so much over the years, but this cow was the last part of her life she held dear. The man moved quickly, setting up barriers and using anything he could find to create a defensive perimeter. Ruth helped where she could, her hands shaking with the effort but steady in purpose. She could feel the weight of the situation settling in. This wasn't just about her cow anymore. It was about survival. It was about facing down the odds, not with brute strength, but with determination. As the man continued to work, Ruth caught his eye. "Do you think we can hold them off?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of exhaustion and hope. The man paused for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distance. Then, without hesitation, he turned back to Ruth. "As long as we fight together, we have a chance." The words hung in the air, a promise, a challenge, and a hope all wrapped into one. Ruth took a deep breath. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but with the man by her side, she felt for the first time in hours that they might just make it through this. The coyotes might be relentless, but so was she. And together, they would fight to protect what mattered most. The man and Ruth worked tirelessly, reinforcing their makeshift shelter with whatever they could find. Every few minutes, they would stop, listen, and scan the horizon for any signs of movement. The coyotes had not given up, and neither had they. As the sun climbed higher, the relentless heat began to take its toll. Ruth felt the weight of exhaustion in every bone, but she knew there was no time to rest. Her cow, her only companion, needed her. They were far from safe, and the battle was only beginning. The man worked with purpose, his movements efficient and deliberate. Ruth couldn't help but admire his determination. It was as though he had done this before. "We need more rocks," he said, his voice calm and steady. "The coyotes will find a way through if we don't reinforce the perimeter." Ruth nodded, already moving to gather more rocks. She had lived a life of solitude, but never had she felt the weight of isolation as much as she did now. Yet, in this fight, she wasn't alone. She had this man beside her, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. Hours passed, the sun now hanging low in the sky. The air was thick with tension, every creak of the wind through the trees setting Ruth on edge. The coyotes had disappeared into the distance for now, but Ruth knew they were just regrouping, preparing for their next attack. The man's eyes were sharp, his senses on high alert. He walked the perimeter, checking every corner, making sure there were no weaknesses in their defense. Ruth stayed with the cow, trying to keep her calm, but even the animal seemed to sense the danger. It shifted nervously, its eyes darting toward the tree line. "We have to be ready for when they come back," the man said, his voice low and filled with urgency. Ruth didn't argue. She knew he was right. The coyotes would be back, and this time, they would be stronger, more determined. But so would they. They had no choice but to fight. Ruth glanced at the man, her throat tight with emotion. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed as though he wouldn't answer. But then, he spoke, his voice steady. "Because you're not alone. No one should ever have to face something like this by themselves." Ruth felt her heart swell with gratitude. She had spent so many years alone, fighting battles no one knew about. But here, in this moment, she wasn't alone anymore. The man continued his work, but Ruth couldn't help but feel a sense of camaraderie building between them. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper, something human. As dusk began to settle over the land, the man stood next to Ruth, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "They're coming," he said softly. Ruth's heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the trees. The coyotes had returned, their figures dark against the twilight sky. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. The moment she had feared had finally arrived. But she didn't feel fear. Not anymore. The man was by her side, and together, they would face the pack. Ruth lifted her rifle, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had been through so much, and now, in this moment, she would fight for what mattered most. The coyotes advanced, their eyes glowing in the fading light. But Ruth stood tall, her resolve unshaken. The man was ready, too. They had done everything they could to prepare, and now it was time to face the fight head-on. "Stay close," the man said, his voice low. Ruth nodded, her focus solely on the coyotes. This was it. The battle for her cow, for her home, and for her survival. The coyotes were closing in, but Ruth and the man were ready. Together, they would fight. And together, they would win. The coyotes were closer now, their eyes glowing in the twilight, a menacing army moving with purpose. Ruth's grip on her rifle tightened, her fingers cold but steady as she aimed at the first coyote that dared to get too close. She could hear the rustling of the pack, their growls low and ominous, but she didn't flinch. The man beside her was calm, his rifle poised, his eyes scanning the advancing pack with the same quiet intensity. Ruth had never imagined she would be in this kind of fight, but here she was, standing shoulder to shoulder with a stranger who had become her only ally in a battle for survival. The man fired first, a quick, controlled shot that took down a coyote from the pack's front. The animal dropped, its body hitting the ground with a heavy thud, but the pack didn't slow down. Instead, they charged, more relentless than ever. Ruth fired, her shot hitting another coyote, but the rest of the pack kept coming. It was as if they were driven by something beyond hunger, something more primal, more instinctual. Ruth's heart raced as she fired again, the noise of the rifle deafening in the still air. She could hear the coyotes growling, their paws scraping against the dirt as they closed in. She glanced at the man beside her. His face was set, his determination unshakable. They had no choice but to keep fighting. "We need to hold them off," he said, his voice steady. "We can't let them get any closer to the cow." Ruth nodded, her jaw clenched. The cow, her only companion, was her responsibility. She couldn't let the coyotes win. As the pack circled them, Ruth and the man moved as one, firing in quick succession, taking down one coyote after another. But for every one they brought down, two more seemed to take its place. Ruth's arms were sore from the constant firing, but she refused to stop. The fight was too important. The coyotes were not just a threat to her cow. They were a threat to everything she had left in the world. Ruth's eyes darted between the pack and the man, who was still firing without hesitation. He was a skilled marksman, Ruth noticed, every shot precise and calculated. But even his skill was not enough to stop the relentless tide of coyotes. They were everywhere now, their snarls filling the air, the sound of their claws scraping against the ground echoing in Ruth's ears. The man moved toward her, his rifle still aimed at the oncoming pack. "We need a new strategy," he said, his voice low but urgent. Ruth didn't ask what he meant. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, and she knew he was right. They couldn't keep this up forever. "We need to get them to retreat," Ruth said, her mind racing. But how? The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed their surroundings. Then, without warning, he grabbed Ruth's arm and pulled her toward a large boulder at the edge of the field. "Climb," he commanded. Ruth didn't hesitate. She knew this was their only chance. With the man covering her, Ruth climbed the boulder, her breath coming fast as she pulled herself up. The coyotes were closing in, but the high ground would give them an advantage. The man was right behind her, his rifle never wavering. When they reached the top, Ruth took a deep breath and scanned the area. The coyotes had stopped advancing, but they were still circling, waiting for an opening. Ruth's eyes darted to the horizon. In the distance, she could see the pack beginning to regroup. "We need to make them think we're not worth the fight," the man said, his voice low. "We need to give them a reason to leave." Ruth's heart raced as she realized what he meant. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a flare gun that had been given to her by a neighbor years ago. It was old, but it might still work. She had no choice. She fired the flare into the sky, the bright red light shooting up, illuminating the entire field. The coyotes froze, their eyes locked on the bright light. Ruth held her breath, hoping it would be enough. The pack hesitated for a moment, and in that moment, Ruth saw their doubt. The man fired another shot into the air, the noise of the rifle loud and sharp. The coyotes, confused and wary, began to retreat. Slowly at first, then faster, their bodies disappearing into the shadows of the trees. Ruth let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. It was over. For now. The man turned to her, his face hard but satisfied. "That's how you get them to leave," he said quietly. Ruth nodded, her chest still heaving from the adrenaline. They had won, but Ruth knew the fight wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, more battles to face. But for now, they had survived. And that was all that mattered. The coyotes had retreated into the darkness, but Ruth knew it wasn't over. She had seen their eyes, glowing in the night, and felt the hunger in them. They would come back, and next time, there might be more. The man stood beside her, his rifle still slung across his back, his expression unreadable. They both knew that while the immediate danger had passed, the threat was still looming. Ruth turned to him, her heart still pounding from the fight. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up." The man gave a short nod, his eyes scanning the horizon. "You would have fought. You were already doing it." Ruth shook her head, her eyes downcast. "But I don't know if I could have kept going. The coyotes, they were too many." He paused, his gaze shifting back to her. "You're stronger than you think. You just needed someone to stand beside you." Ruth felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel so alone. They had faced the danger together, and that bond, unspoken but real, had made all the difference. The man didn't speak for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. "We need to keep moving. The coyotes won't stop, and we can't stay here long. The best chance we have is to keep the cow safe and get you to higher ground." Ruth nodded. She didn't need to be told twice. She had been running on adrenaline, but now that the immediate threat had passed, the exhaustion hit her hard. Her muscles ached, and her mind felt foggy, but she knew there was no time for rest. She had to move, for herself and for the cow. She checked on the animal, which was still tied securely to the boulder. It was quiet now, its breathing shallow but steady. Ruth patted its side gently. "It's all right, girl. We made it through." The man was already moving, gathering his gear and checking the area one last time. Ruth followed him, her feet dragging but determined. The night air was cold now, the warmth of the day slowly fading. The shadows stretched long across the land, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel underfoot as they walked. The man moved with purpose, his steps sure and steady. Ruth had no doubt that he had been through battles like this before. He had the look of a man who had survived the wilderness time and time again. They made their way up a small hill, the ground growing steeper as they climbed. Ruth's breath was labored, but she kept pushing forward. The man reached the top first and stopped, turning to look back at her. "This is where we'll make camp," he said, his voice firm. "We'll need to keep watch through the night." Ruth nodded, but she felt a pang of unease. They had made it up the hill, but she didn't know how long they could hold out. The coyotes had learned her scent, and now they knew where to find her. The man began setting up a campfire, his movements efficient. Ruth helped, her hands shaking with the effort, but she pushed through. As the fire crackled to life, she sat down on a nearby rock, her exhaustion settling in. She wanted to ask the man more questions, to learn who he was and why he was helping her. But for now, silence felt like the only safe option. They needed rest, and the night was their only chance. The coyotes were still out there, but Ruth had something they didn't. She had a partner, someone who would fight beside her. She wasn't alone anymore. As the fire flickered in the darkness, Ruth sat with her back against the rock, staring into the flames. She thought of everything she had lost, her husband, the land that had once been full of life, and everything she was fighting to protect. She had nothing left except this cow, this one thing that still mattered. She couldn't lose it. She wouldn't. The man sat across from her, his eyes on the horizon, his rifle within arm's reach. Ruth couldn't help but admire his calm. He was ready for whatever came next, and that steadiness was a comfort. But she knew they couldn't stay on this hill forever. The coyotes would be back, and there was no telling when the next attack would come. She stood up slowly, her legs aching from the climb. "We should keep moving at first light," she said. I don't know how much longer we can stay here. The man looked at her, a faint nod of agreement. We move when the sun rises. Get some rest while you can. Ruth sat back down, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the fire sink into her bones. She was exhausted, but the fight wasn't over. She wasn't done yet. And neither was the man who had come to her aid. Together, they would survive whatever came next. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Ruth felt the weight of the night settle deep into her bones. The fire had burned low, its warmth now a faint memory, and the cool morning air cut through her like a blade. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and glanced at the man who had kept watch through the night. His eyes were focused, sharp, scanning the landscape with a calm that only came from experience. They had made it through the night, but the fight was far from over. The Coyotes would return, and this time, they would be better prepared. Ruth stood up slowly, her muscles stiff from the cold and the tension of the previous day's battle. She felt the weight of her rifle on her shoulder, the only thing that had kept her safe in the chaos. But now, as the sun rose, she realized that the true test was just beginning. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the cow, the only living thing she had left to care for. The man, too, was already moving, his rifle at the ready. We need to move out, he said, his voice low. The Coyotes won't be far behind. We'll have to keep going until we find a safer place. Ruth nodded, her eyes on the cow, which was still tied to the rock. It seemed calm for now, but Ruth knew it wouldn't take long for the Coyotes to find them again. We can't stay here, she agreed, her voice hoarse from the night air. Let's go. The man began to lead the way, his steps deliberate and confident. Ruth followed closely behind, keeping her eyes on the cow and on the man, who seemed to know exactly where he was going. The sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the land, and the once quiet wilderness was coming to life. The sound of birds in the trees and the rustling of the wind in the grass was a stark contrast to the previous night's chaos. But Ruth couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in her chest. The Coyotes were still out there, watching, waiting for their next opportunity. As they moved through the terrain, Ruth couldn't help but notice the way the man moved. His every action calculated, his every step sure. It was clear that he had lived through more than his share of hardship, just like her. They shared an unspoken bond now, forged through the battle they had fought together. Where are we headed? Ruth asked, breaking the silence. The man glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. There's a creek a few miles from here, he replied. It's our best chance for water and cover. We'll have to make it there before the Coyotes regroup. Ruth nodded, her mind already calculating the distance. The creek was close, but it was still a long way to travel. She didn't know if they had enough time. Do you think we can outrun them? She asked. The man's lips pressed into a thin line. We're not running. We're staying ahead of them, he said, his tone firm. If we can keep moving, we'll find a place to regroup. But we need to stay sharp. The Coyotes won't give up. Ruth took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation settle in. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about outsmarting the pack. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. As they continued on, Ruth's mind raced. She thought about her home, her life before all of this. She had always been independent, but this was something different. She had never imagined she would be fighting for her life, with no one to help her. But now, with the man beside her, she felt a strange sense of calm. She wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like they had a chance. They moved quickly, the sounds of their footsteps muffled by the tall grass, as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Ruth kept her eyes peeled for any sign of the Coyotes, her rifle at the ready. The man was ahead of her, leading the way, his eyes always on the lookout. Ruth knew that he was just as determined to make it through this as she was. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear, they couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close to safety. As they approached the creek, Ruth could see the glimmer of water in the distance. It was a small stream, but it offered the chance of survival. They would need to take a break, regroup, and plan their next move. Ruth could feel the weight of exhaustion, but she also felt a renewed sense of hope. They had made it this far. They could make it all the way. The Coyotes were relentless, but so were they. The creek came into view just as the sun reached its peak, casting the landscape in a harsh light. The sound of the water rushing over rocks was a relief to Ruth's ears after the long hours of tense silence. They had made it to the creek, but there was no time to rest. The coyotes were out there, still hunting, still watching. Ruth and the man didn't stop. They moved quickly, using the creek as cover. The man led the way, stepping carefully, while Ruth followed close behind, her rifle ready in case of any sudden movement. She kept her eyes on the water, watching for signs of anything unusual. The last thing they needed was to let their guard down. As they made their way through the thick brush near the creek's edge, Ruth could feel the exhaustion settling in, but there was no time for fatigue. She had to stay sharp. The man moved silently, his steps light, as though he was one with the land. He didn't seem to tire. Ruth admired his strength and resilience. She had never seen someone so focused, so determined. It was clear he had been through worse. "We should set up a temporary camp here," the man said after a while, his voice low. "It's safer than being out in the open. We can keep watch, rest for a bit, and make a plan." Ruth nodded, her throat dry. She was grateful for the suggestion, even though she knew they couldn't stay long. The coyotes would be back, and they needed to move on before they were cornered. The man worked quickly, gathering branches and logs from the nearby trees to create a small shelter. Ruth kept watch, her eyes darting between the trees and the creek, listening for any sign of movement. Her heart was racing, but she forced herself to breathe steadily. She couldn't afford to let fear take over. As the man finished setting up the shelter, he turned to her. "You'll need to rest," he said, his voice calm. "We've made it through the worst of it, but there's more ahead. You can't keep going if you don't take a break." Ruth hesitated. She didn't want to stop. Every moment felt like a gamble, and the longer they stayed in one place, the greater the chance the coyotes would find them. But she knew the man was right. She needed to rest, even if just for a few minutes. She sat down by the creek, her eyes still scanning the area. The man sat next to her, keeping his gaze on the horizon, his rifle always within reach. Ruth took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs. It was strange, sitting here in the quiet after everything that had happened. The danger hadn't passed, but for the first time in days, she felt a small sense of peace. The man turned to her, his eyes studying her face. "You've got more fight in you than most people half your age," he said, his tone sincere. Ruth smiled weakly, but the compliment didn't feel like much. "I've had to," she said, her voice hoarse. "Life doesn't stop just because you're tired." The man gave a small nod. "I know what you mean." They sat in silence for a moment, the sound of the creek filling the quiet space between them. Ruth's mind was still racing, going over every possible scenario, every possible danger. But it was hard to think clearly when exhaustion was weighing so heavily on her. The man stood up after a few moments, his eyes scanning the trees. "We can't stay here too long," he said again. "We need to get to higher ground. The coyotes will pick up our trail soon enough." Ruth nodded, standing with him. She felt a pang of regret for the brief rest she'd allowed herself, but there was no time to waste. They packed up the small shelter quickly, moving with urgency. As they prepared to leave, Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that the coyotes were closing in. Every rustle of leaves, every shifting shadow felt like a threat. But the man was still calm, still focused. He wasn't worried about the things Ruth was afraid of. He knew how to survive, how to keep moving, how to stay ahead of the danger. They followed the creek upstream, climbing higher into the hills. The terrain was rough, and Ruth's legs ached with every step, but she kept moving. The man didn't slow down, and Ruth didn't want to fall behind. She had to keep up. As they neared the top of the hill, Ruth felt a sense of relief. From up here, they could see for miles, and the coyotes would have a harder time sneaking up on them. The man stopped for a moment, surveying the land. "We'll make camp here," he said, his voice firm. "We have a better chance of holding our ground." Ruth looked around, feeling the weight of their situation. They had made it this far, but the road ahead was still uncertain. The coyotes were relentless, and they had no way of knowing when the next attack would come. But Ruth knew one thing. She wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. Together, they had made it through the worst, and they would face whatever came next with everything they had left. The night had fallen quietly, the stars now scattered across the sky like a blanket of comfort after the chaos of the day. Ruth sat by the small fire they had built, the crackling of the flames the only sound breaking the silence between her and the man. They had made it through another day, Another set of dangers that could have easily meant the end. But they were still here, still standing. The coyotes had not returned, but the feeling of being watched, hunted, lingered in the air like a thick fog. Ruth's body was weary from the constant movement, the fear, the survival, but her mind wouldn't let her rest. She glanced over at the man, who was sharpening his rifle, his expression focused but calm. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though this was a routine he had perfected over time. Ruth didn't know his story. She didn't know where he had come from or what had led him to this exact place at this exact moment. But she did know one thing. He was the reason she had survived. Without him, she would have been overwhelmed by the pack, too weak to protect the one thing she had left. And now, as they sat together on the edge of that quiet night, Ruth realized something. She wasn't just fighting for the cow anymore. She was fighting for herself, for the strength she had forgotten she still had. "We've made it this far," Ruth said, breaking the silence. The man didn't look up, but his shoulders tensed, acknowledging her words. "But it's not over, is it?" she continued, her voice soft but firm. "No," the man replied, still focused on his rifle. "It's never over. But we'll keep fighting. As long as we have to." Ruth nodded, a sense of resolve settling over her. She had no illusions that everything would be fine. The coyotes would come again. They always did. But this time, Ruth was ready. She wasn't just going to survive. She was going to stand her ground, no matter what. As the fire burned low, Ruth felt a peace she hadn't known in years. Maybe it was because, for the first time, she wasn't alone. Maybe it was because she knew that if she fell, the man would be there to help her up. Or maybe it was because, in the quiet of the night, she finally realized that she could survive this. She could survive anything. The man stood up suddenly, his eyes scanning the horizon one more time before he turned to Ruth. "We should get some rest. Tomorrow, we move again." Ruth felt a moment of hesitation. They had fought so hard, and now, after all the struggle, it almost seemed like the right thing to do. Just rest, stay put. But deep down, she knew he was right. They had to keep moving. They couldn't stay here forever. "You're right," she said, standing up. "We'll keep moving." The man nodded, his eyes softening slightly. "We've got this." Ruth didn't respond. She didn't need to. They both knew what was at stake, and they knew what they had to do. The fight wasn't over, but they were stronger now. Together, they had become something unstoppable. As the night grew darker, Ruth laid down by the fire, the warmth of the flames against the cool air. She closed her eyes, but her mind was still racing, still preparing for the battle that would come. Yet, in that moment, she wasn't afraid. She had made it this far. She would make it through whatever came next. In the stillness of the night, Ruth realized that it wasn't just the coyotes that she was fighting. She was fighting the years of fear, the weight of loss, the feeling of being forgotten. She wasn't fighting just to survive. She was fighting for the chance to live. And with that, Ruth drifted off to sleep. Her last thought a quiet promise to herself, that no matter what the future held, she would face it with the same strength she had found in this fight. The man had given her a chance to survive. And now, it was time for her to take it. Discover the gripping tale of survival and bravery in the harsh wilderness in these captivating Western stories. A 96-year-old woman, fighting to protect her only cow from a relentless pack of coyotes, finds herself thrust into a battle against nature's most dangerous predators. In this unforgettable saga of resilience, the woman is not alone. A mysterious stranger on horseback arrives just in time to help her fight off the coyotes and safeguard her last remaining companion. As the tension rises and the dangers mount, their bond grows stronger, proving that even in the most desperate circumstances, survival is possible. This collection of Western stories explores themes of courage, partnership, and the will to persevere. It highlights the grit and determination required to outwit and outlast the dangers of the wild. From the first battle against the coyotes to the final stand at dawn, these Western stories take you on a journey filled with suspense, heart-pounding action, and the unbreakable spirit of two individuals who refuse to surrender. The resilience of the woman, paired with the quiet strength of her mysterious ally, brings a new depth to the classic Western tale. As they navigate through the harsh landscape, each decision brings them closer to safety, but the danger never fully subsides. This story is a testament to the power of perseverance and the unspoken connection that can form between strangers in the most extreme conditions. With each new twist in the story, you'll find yourself immersed in a world where survival is a constant challenge, and every step taken could mean the difference between life and death. These Western stories offer an exciting and emotional experience, filled with moments of intense action and deep human connection. Join these two unlikely heroes as they fight to survive, proving that in the wild, only the strong and the determined endure. Get lost in this world of suspense, heartache, and triumph, where survival depends on more than just strength. It depends on the courage to keep going, no matter the odds.